Based on the energy level of the room, I think everyone's busted through their food coma now, and you're ready to talk actual energy policy. So we are amped. So feel free to to let your energy come out, and throughout this this commentary here, we've got an all-star lineup here. We are so excited, and maybe to bridge from the previous panel discussion where they were talking about saving democracy in many ways. We're going to talk about saving the world. So we're just going to bridge this a little bit further. And similarly, as you could tell from the title event here, we will dig into sort of climate change policy and just a broader set of energy policy considerations too. Things that are really in our economic self-interest that also improve environmental outcomes. That's going to be a big focus of today's discussion here. When a lot of us think about contemporary energy and environmental policy, the phrase climate optimism may not be the thing that first comes to anyone's mind this day and age, and there's a reason for that. But we do think that this framing is extremely important, both to break through a lot of the negativity that is pervading a lot of the space now, but really to also talk about where there's very valid reasons to be optimistic. If we work together, we go back to our first principles, we focus on the mutual policy objectives that really are across the political spectrum right now. Of course, before we dig in here with the panelists, I'd be remiss to not get into the acknowledgement too that when it comes to climate change, a lot of the framing of this policy solution set has been that it's a pervasive, if not dominating, market failure, and the only way it's going to be resolved is with massive government intervention that necessarily involves economic sacrifice. And I say that as a backdrop because that does kind of put on display some of the tensions that I think the economic freedom community has had historically with validating and getting involved in a productive climate movement. But what we're seeing is when you lift up the hood on what policies actually get emissions reductions, there are so many things that are in our economic self-interest today. And if you think about, regardless of where the political spectrum is, the sort of the principled or the populist movements on both sides that we're seeing, everyone cares about economic self-interest in different ways and the trade-offs that are associated with that to achieve other societal goals like emissions reductions. And so we really see, in fact, going forward that maybe government failure, at least in the energy sector, might be the bigger impediment to emissions reductions now. And when you fix government failure, that just happens to be good old-fashioned economic policy that has huge climate co-benefits. So with that sort of optimistic framing here, I want to introduce our panelists, kick things underway, and we have a very organic conversation for everyone. Sarah will have to leave us a little bit early, but we're going to have a great, robust conversation up front and be able to fully flesh out this issue set as quickly as we can in 15 minutes or so. So going left to right here, on my left we have Dr. Lynne Kiesling, who insists on going by Lynne. For those that might want to approach her afterwards, she is the director of, among other hats, the director of the Institute for Regulatory Law and Economics at Northwestern University. Another hat she wears prominently is a non-resident senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and has a cool project in that role that we'll talk about in a little bit. On her right, facing the stage on her right, we have Nick Loris, who's the Vice President of Public Policy at C3 Solutions. C3 Solutions is a conservative group focused on climate solutions. Nick and his co-founders at C3 all have a Heritage Foundation lineage, and so really bring a fascinating perspective to the future of climate conversations. And then on the right there further, we have Sarah Ladislaw. Sarah is Managing Director of U.S. Policy for the Rocky Mountain Institute and brings a whole suite of backgrounds prior to her role at RMI too. And we're really excited both to dig into everyone's knowledge base and talk about the collaborative opportunities that you observe and the progress being done, actually, in many cases, the undercurrent of progress being made out in the field with our partners, many of whom are here in the audience today. So with that, I'm going to start off with a real softball, and we'll let this conversation go a little bit more organically. But when we think about the extent of the thesis of how much good economic policy is there that is in our self-interest, but also drives environmental improvement, we think about a very liberty-compatible agenda starting to emerge. And so I'd be curious to get your high-level thoughts on the validation of that thesis, the depth of that thesis, and sort of the ways and forms that you're seeing it pop up, both in the work you're doing and some of your contemporaries. Let's start with Lynne.
I'll start with a couple of brief things. First of all, thank you, and Devin, and thanks to our street for inviting me. This is going to be a fun conversation. And throughout, I've been working on energy policy, electricity regulation, research, and translational research for regulators for about 25 years. And for most of that time, my focus has been at the intersection of electricity and digital technologies. And so I worked early on some of the smart grid modernization, interoperability type, and dynamic pricing before that. And so when and my research tends to focus on technological change. And so my first thought about your question, Devin, is looking at that intersection with digital technology and technological change more broadly, is that if we think about technological change as the instantiation of human creativity, that we have no scarcity of that. And that most of the challenges of most environmental challenges, whether they're climate associated or other issues, once you realize them and experience them and know that they exist, then a lot of the ways that we harness our creativity to try to deal with them is through innovation and technological change. And I think that's where I think there's a big cause for optimism. And one example of that is if you look at, and it's always going to be complicated, and I'm sure that's going to be the kind of dominant hashtag it's complicated is going to be the theme here, because in this space the energy industries have never been since Adam Thierer is in the room, I'm going to say born in the wild, right? They have always had government policy interacting with, there's always been government intervention in energy industries. But if you look at and that's absolutely true in electricity and associated generation technologies, but if you look at for example, the effects that you would expect to see in terms of installation of new technologies, solar adoption, for example, that if you estimate out what kind of solar adoption would be associated with policy drivers, that the solar adoption we've actually seen has far exceeded that. And so there are a lot of drivers of technological change that are reducing production costs and creating value propositions for end users that are attractive enough that they are adopting it above and beyond what the policy driver would have created. So those are my causes for optimism.
Yeah, and to pick up on that, to step back and talk about what Devin first said of, how do we have good economic policy that has climate co-benefits? I think that's where U.S. leadership can really increase in this area. We always talk about U.S. leadership in climate policy, and does that mean us having the loudest and biggest voice at COPs? Does it mean we have the biggest and largest amounts of taxpayer-funded subsidies? I don't think so. I kind of reject that premise and say our leadership is in that technological innovation and driving these cost declines, so it is in the economic self-interest for other countries to adopt and deploy these technologies at scale. So I think that there's a lot of optimism where the private sector is leading the way in low emissions or zero emissions technologies in the energy sector, in the transportation sector, really across sectors that have emissions, ag sector as well. And my case for optimism is really that there is more of an understanding, I think, both from kind of like this eco-right crowd as well as kind of the eco-left abundance crowd, that government policy is standing in the way. And there can be real opportunities, whether it's on permitting reform and regulatory reform or on more productive tax policy, that there are easier levers to pull that are technology neutral and agnostic that allow for more of these technologies to compete in the marketplace and provide value to the consumer. And so therefore, when there are opportunities for other countries who are very energy poor or do not have access to the transportation and infrastructure needs that we currently have, but are the overwhelming drivers of future emissions growth because they are going to be the ones building these generating sources, building more transportation infrastructure, consuming more, that we have an opportunity to lay the foundation from a technology standpoint for these countries to adopt and deploy those resources and technologies. So I think looking at what the private sector is doing across the energy sector, across the transportation sector, whether it is on small modular nuclear reactors, enhanced geothermal, which I think was really an afterthought a few years ago, and now it is becoming more and more mainstream. That just shows how quickly the pace of innovation can come in the energy sector. And really with this private sector leadership, there's a lot of opportunities to get the government out of the way.
Yeah, and maybe to build on that, it's like we planned this, but we didn't quite as detailed. I agree with all of that, and I think that I come at this from sort of a geostrategic competition perspective. I know I work at RMI, but that's my background. And I think that what we've seen, particularly when it comes to tackling the climate problem or thinking about energy transition more broadly and all of the drivers of that, is that there is a time for very different types of policy approaches. I think, one thing, and this is not to not be optimistic, but like we have to be very careful about saying, if we just sort of like unleash the market, everything will happen and it'll be just fine. We are not in a world of geostrategic competition that like we can try that across the board. However, and I'm not suggesting any of you said that, but we are playing on a landscape where there are other competitors that just don't do that, right? And so to what end do you think we are engaging in a clean energy transition? I think we have to sort of set some parameters for like, what does it mean to actually succeed? And I think what we are in a period of time right now is to say, geez, we just went through this experience where for the purposes of a whole bunch of drivers of geostrategic competition, maybe to fight inflation, perhaps to do something about climate change, we had all of these programs and policies and incentives that were put into the market, and some of them worked and some of them didn't. And so we kind of need to learn from those experiences. And I think one of the major things we learned is the way in which we regulate those sectors and we govern the build out of infrastructure renders us broadly uncompetitive. Like that's pretty hard, right? So like it's actually like one of those magical moments in time where like a deregulatory agenda that is very well thought through can be extremely helpful in doing exactly what we need to meet the market where it is. And I think that that is like a source of intense optimism because we have something we can do that is immediately catalytic to everything we've like laid the groundwork for in our innovation agenda, and it's what the markets kind of want of us. And so I think the question is like, how do we organize our politics and our policy to recognize all the places where that's true, and then also recognize like what that has to do with our trade agenda, what that has to do with how we incentivize those technologies, so we get sort of the balance and the mix of all of those things right. But to me, it's like, for someone who's lived in a sort of, lonely bipartisan middle of the road most of my life, it's enormously like energizing to be like, oh great, like there's all these through lines onto what we can do now that are exactly along the same lines of how do we deploy, more competitive, more competent, more cost-effective technologies that also allow us to, participate in those global markets, not just make things better for, Americans here. But we have to focus on some different things now too, right? I mean, we've been doing a lot of things in an atmosphere where people are telling us like affordability really matters. Okay, so what's affordability? Like what's affordable? How do we define that? How do we protect that? How do we think about that both for industries and consumers? And then how do we think about just being more competent in the industries and the sort of things we're trying to build over time?
Absolutely. I'm glad you brought up the affordability piece too, because that seems to be the buzzword in the energy industry right now. Whether it was the new sheriff in town here at the White House and in Congress, or just what really dominates in the states. In fact, I can even reference a couple reports here recently, again across the political spectrum. The Progressive Policy Institute recently put out a paper in February that said, by the way, the just transition frame from the progressive view needs to put energy costs first. So you're seeing that interesting frame up there, and that's been a tension point for some folks on the left as they reconcile different policy instruments. But then at the same time, ALEC puts out their energy affordability report here recently, and you're like, boy, it seems like everyone's really focused on keeping energy costs down, keeping supplies reliable, and regardless of the variances in the willingness to pay across the political spectrum for emissions reductions, folks generally care about that too, to varying extents. And so those, reinforcing those policy objectives is big. And I kind of want to bring it down now to talk about some particular policies, but then also get into, well, if there's so many solution sets out there, there's so much good economic policy we can make that has all these great, wins across the board, why is it so hard to get that done, right? And I want to kind of, I'm going to turn it back to Lynne here in a second, because there's an interesting political economy I want to tug at before we get into thinking about collaboratives and how you overcome entrenched interests. Because the recent headlines with Warren Buffett kind of caught my eye. What was Warren Buffett's sort of investment thesis largely? Look at competitive moats. Competitive moats can happen organically in a marketplace. They can also be engineered politically. And if you go into the Chicago School of Economic Thought, we've seen for decades now, we've accumulated a lot of competitive moats out there in industry, and there's entrenched interests that benefit from that. There's also folks that benefit from good economic policy, not just the environmental benefits too. You think of consumer groups, you think of taxpayer groups, and a bunch of others. There's a lot of other folks in this space that benefit from this policy that will validate this agenda to help overcome that political economy challenge. So with that, I want to punt it back to you all and say, what are some examples of policies in this field, and what are types of collaborations that you all are engaged with or that you see in the field, not just between think tanks like us talking shop, but also talking about to the folks with skin in the game and saying, here's how we can get you involved and we can do work to help you all out to see this theory of change put into action.
I may not get to the collaborations, but I want to start with the, picking up this thread and pulling in your affordability, but start from the point of view that regulation in electricity, regulation is a moat. It's not a competitive, it's not an emergent organic moat. It's a government-granted monopoly. And so since this is supposed to be a real solution summit, I think I'm not going to end up on my punchline, which usually is we have to really go back and rethink the Federal Power Act of 1935. But we have to rethink the Federal Power Act. Yeah. But I think bringing the affordability point forward and with the what can we do to help create the deregulatory moment that Sarah alluded to, I think from an affordability perspective, there are a few facts that are important, and I will name check Josh Smith of the Abundance Institute, who is here in the audience. So talk to Josh about this, because he's done some good work on this. That inflation adjusted the actual retail rates to regulated captive utility customers. So do not forget the fact that utility customers, you're the electric company, you are a captive customer of that company, with some exceptions. That big exception being Texas. That on an inflation-adjusted basis, retail rates have not really gone up that much, but the composition of them has changed dramatically. And in places places that have wholesale competitive markets, like the Mid-Atlantic, New England, Texas, and even California, where they have pretty competitive, legitimately competitive liquid, robust wholesale power markets, the energy portion of what you pay, or what the typical customer pays per month for electricity, the energy portion has fallen, and it's the infrastructure part that has grown. And that's not because the utilities are out building more poles and wires willy-nilly, even though regulation gives them an incentive to do that, but they're not building poles and wires willy-nilly. In fact, in some places, there's a lot of criticism that the infrastructure has not kept up and not been maintained and expanded. But infrastructure is just getting more and more and more costly to build, and this is a characteristic that electricity shares with other industries with respect to siting and permitting and NEPA and all of that whole constellation of issues. So to the extent that we can finally have a serious, meaningful conversation about those issues, then maybe we can build more infrastructure. But the other types of innovations that are occurring in this industry are highly decentralized, small scale, and they allow us to do things at much smaller scale, and so more scattered and decentralized and distributed, both in size and spatially, that we used to have to do with big, capital-intensive infrastructure. And so both of those things are going on at the same time, which is one reason why this is a very fertile period for right now in electricity, because there's a lot going on.
Yeah, I mean, I think to your first question as to, there's so many good ideas out there, why is it so darn hard? I mean, I think political economy is really the name of the game there. And, I spent, I think 14 or so years working on various energy policies now, and one of my white whales was the Jones Act, and I probably spent way too much time writing, thinking, and trying to fix the Jones Act. But that's one policy where it affects many aspects of the energy sector, liquefied natural gas, but also offshore wind. You think about something like the renewable fuel standard, which I think most folks on the left and the right would recognize most of that policy, at least first-generation biofuels, as a bad economic and environmental policy that also raises food prices. And that's not to say we wouldn't have any ethanol in the fuel supply, because it's a good oxygenate and can help meet emission standards. But that policy has created a set of entrenched interests where unproductive resources are stuck in place, and it becomes so difficult to unstick them. So I think when I think about the good economic policies that are out there that have real shots of being signed into law, I think about the ones that are where rising tides lift all boats. And I was going to name check Josh Smith as well, because we just...
Josh, do you want to come up here and join the panel?
Yeah. Should we make this like The Price is Right? Come on down. We just released a paper this morning on immediate expensing policy, a tax policy that rewards capital stock turnover. It allows companies to deduct their costs in the year they're incurred rather than amortize them over time. And that works well if you are a solar array, if you're a wind farm, if you're a small modular reactor and have components there, as well as incentivizing more efficient HVACs and heat water systems, things like that. So there's those types of policies, and I think that's why permitting gained some real momentum as well, because there was a more recognition that as we had more and more of these subsidies, it was the putting up the pressure on a king's hose, and that a disproportionate amount of these projects were actually clean energy and transmission projects that were being held up for years by the regulatory permitting process, or being held up for years in litigation. So if you have folks who are concerned about forest management, and those projects are being held up in the courts. If you have folks that are concerned about transmission, those projects are being held up by the courts. Natural gas pipelines. Now you start to see a coalition, maybe of stakeholders that not necessarily always worked well together, but trying to come up with a policy that makes substantive reform with regards to permitting and fixing the judicial review process. So that's where I see some real opportunities, hopefully with this Congress and this administration.
Yeah, I agree, and I'd like to encourage Lynne to go back to her. Let's go look at the Federal Power Act, because what I'm really excited about at this stage is we've had so many conversations about the electric power system, and I do think right now disproportionately the excitement over AI and semiconductors and a whole bunch of folks that want to do load growth exercises and build out, whether they ultimately reach whatever, like large projections we think may or may not be true or not, it is forcing a conversation about how ridiculous it is that we regulate the electric power system the way that we do. And in the past, not like the past, but like, just the most recent past, like we've had like incremental conversations about that, whether it's like congestion, permitting and siting authority, eminent domain, like we've had all these, we had a lot of tax incentives and grant-based programs and the Inflation Reduction Act, the bipartisan infrastructure law. But at its core, everyone was like, no, we're not trying to like reinvent the wheel here. This is kind of a bad wheel. So the thing I'm excited about in this political environment is we do have a administration that's sort of kind of willing to take out big topics and say, this doesn't make any sense. Now, what I'm worried about is like there's no vision for wholesale like what would replace it. And that should scare like literally everybody who has an asset in the electric power system in the United States. But it's not like there's no ideas, there's a whole bunch of stuff about interregional transmission planning. There's a lot about performance-based rate making, or how you can better incentivize planning in the different RTOs. There's just so much that we know needs to get fixed, that to actually have like a big discussion about throwing around some like federal renegotiation of who owns what and why, we basically just, we have two EOs, one that says that, FERC rules get to go through some OMB review process, and we've got another one that says they get to sunset after 5 years. I think we're already putting big things on the table. So let's put something big on the table, and let's ask a question about like what we should be doing here. So sorry, Lynne.
So yeah, I can pull my list out of
yeah. Hopefully we're being supportive.
But just for those of you who do not eat, sleep, and breathe electricity every moment of your life, so the Federal Power Act of 1935 is part of the New Deal suite of legislation, and essentially delineated the regulatory jurisdiction between state regulators, because the electricity industry grew in a very bottom-up way. And so all of the kind of initial regulatory apparatus was very much at the state Public Utility Commission level. And then they started doing some emergency arrangements. So Devin's in Delaware, I'm in Pennsylvania, and I have a generator that goes down, so I call him up and I'm like, hey, can you sell me 5 megawatts at 2 p.m.? And he'll say, sure, and then I pay him, but that crosses a state line. And so, of course, the federal government's like, whoa, 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 whoa. And so we get federal jurisdiction. And that bright line between federal and state is enshrined in the Federal Power Act. And there's two problems with that. Number one, it's technologically a fiction. And we have kind of built pieces of the system to entrench that fiction. But it's technologically a fiction, and there are a lot of technological changes going on in power electronics and other techie pieces of the grid that are making that line very blurry. But number two, the data centers, the growth of data centers and the data center energy use issue that's very, very, very top of mind right now is going to be an inflection point. And but here's why it's important, and you may not realize this, and hopefully you'll be suitably shocked by it. If I go, let's say Devin goes and wants to build a data center, and he goes to some place, a plot of land that had never been developed, and he wants to build a data center, and the time it's going to take to get interconnected into the grid and to get electric service for that data center is on the order in PJM, where we sit right now, is on the order of 7 years. And so if you're in the tech industry and time to power, right? You build your data center, time to power is more, you want it to be more like 2 years. 7 years is just completely a non-starter. So there is an entire industry called independent power producers. You might call one of them, or microgrid developers, you might call one of them to set you up on a microgrid, and they own the power plant on your property. But as soon as you start doing that, the local utility in whose territory you are is going to come knocking at the door and say, excuse me, you can't do that because we have an obligation to serve you, and therefore you have an obligation to be served by us. Insert H.L. Mencken's Good and Hard right here, right now. So, that's entrenched in the Federal Power Act, and it's a bigger impediment to distributed entrepreneurial private innovation than you would imagine.
Yeah, and I'm glad we were, I knew somebody would bring up the AI energy appetite and the implications. It was inevitable, and of course we have, at our street, we have a tech team that does wonderful work here, but also a lot of you out in the field are very involved in the tech domain too. But I think the AI energy space is a fascinating sort of case study really going forward now about how much or what the policy environment looks like in terms of what enables economic opportunity and, again, achieves environmental outcomes. And I think an important thing that gets overlooked a lot is a lot of times people think, open up your standard economics textbook, and Lynne's an econ professor, so you always think about this in terms of markets maybe don't fully internalize a lot of things or really show a lot of concern necessarily for environmental issues, especially if they accrue to other parties, and you have too many transactions costs because there's too many market participants, so you can't have this sort of the local negotiation that fixes some environmental problems. But then you look at the behavior of some tech companies and a lot of the corporates in this space, and you go my goodness, they are not environmentally agnostic at all. In fact, they're willing to pay a very substantial premium to get a lot of the next-gen technologies out there, which actually shows this interesting opportunity that markets are starting to internalize certain environmental problems that we didn't think, that we never taught in our econ courses that markets really could, like regional or global environmental problems. That's pretty cool. And so another thing that we're seeing kind of pop out right now, and I want to open it up for more deep dives in some of the work that you've done, and then get into some areas where we do see some contention among stakeholders, is getting into what aspects go into, what are the sort of criteria for being ready for energy demand growth right now. So much of the policy apparatus is decentralized, right? So when we think about what's holding back a lot of these forms of good economic policy, it's not just the political economy, it's that most of the solution sets are really technocratic. A lot of it's going to have to go through regulatory bodies, or you're going to have to explain a lot of minutia to someone in Congress or the state legislature to get them to do surgical strikes on this stuff. So when we get into this, what are sort of the key areas that you all see as sort of popping out right now? What collaboratives have kind of worked or butted up and have not? And by the way, Lynne, if you could mention your AEI project, that'd be great.
Go for it.
Let's start with Nick and
Yeah, it's a good question. So maybe a couple of things. I do think that I'm trying to decide which direction to take your question, Devin. I do think that there's a lot of opportunity, particularly right now, to have conversations with policymakers that liked climate as a driver for things were kind of easy to deal with, in the sense that you could give them a relative cost and a relative goal, and they'd be like, yeah, okay, that's it reduces emissions. Great. Now, whether those policies actually reduced emissions or not at the end of the day is why we'll all be employed forever. But right now, there are actually very different drivers for different things. So one of the places we're spending a lot of time with colleagues on this stage and otherwise is something we're calling the American Energy Opportunity Agenda, which is essentially on everything we need out of the electric power sector, on everything we need out of critical minerals, on everything we need out of manufacturing and decarbonizing industry, there are through lines and there are opportunities right now. Not only because we've just made huge amounts of investment, but we actually know that there's bipartisan policy agreement to compete these things forward. The objectives of those things, those economically competitive, those sort of competition spaces, are extremely poorly defined. So we don't actually know what we're shooting at, right? So like, how much reindustrialized activity coming to the United States is enough? And in what sectors? And to what degree? And how innovative should they be? I don't know. Are we supposed to look like the 1950s again, or are we supposed to look like something different? I'm not sure, but we're having lots of policy discussions about how important it is without having like a really clear due north for what the objective is. Same thing on critical minerals. I still, to this day, do not know which critical minerals we're trying to reshore, friendshore, offshore. You know, we have very different and sort of very disputed conversations about those topics, and then what happens is you have a lot of policy orthodoxy within them, which is like, well, I don't like subsidies and I don't like price supports. I promise you I don't understand a world in which we are going to be producing critical minerals in the United States of America without some version of some of those things for some period of time. So we kind of have to have discussions about the relative merits of economic policy and energy policy within those parameters. And I would say it's much more difficult because it really depends like what the end goal of those things is. So the good news is we have like broad, bipartisan, multi-dimensional support for certain things. The tricky part is you're trying to optimize policy for not concrete targets. And that means they might be directionally positive, but it makes it very hard to sort of calibrate what you're doing. I think in some ways that's where deregulation is actually like the deregulatory approaches to those problems is actually really quite helpful because it can reduce the cost across the board for lots of things, which kind of alleviates you from having to answer some of those questions. But the reality is we're going to have to come to being able to answer those questions. And I think it's really tricky because the minute you start, you know, like talking about like dysprobium or something like that with policymakers, they just don't want to talk to you anymore. So you have to, you know, kind of work on that.
Yeah, and I think the energy areas that we now think of as strategic, which can be a very dangerous word because national security can really be kind of the scapegoat for a lot of very, very bad policy, is resurfacing in very different ways because of China, because of Russia. But I do think you're right, Sarah, is critical minerals mining is one where people seem to be cheerleading a lot for opening mines and having more efficient regulations and permitting. But we had a mine in California that has gone through all of those things and was operating and had to shut down because China was flooding the market. And even though they got through all of the regulatory process and the permitting, it was still uneconomic because China was flooding the market with cheap minerals. And we were okay with that for a long time. And maybe we're still okay with that. Maybe we're less okay with that. Maybe we need to think a little more strategically about what that looks like from a national security and a policy perspective. One of the other areas that I think is really interesting is on nuclear policy, which I spend a fair amount of time working on. Is we had the Advance Act passed last year, which made some marginal improvements to how the Nuclear Regulatory Commission licenses reactors. It required that the NRC actually looks at the benefit of adding nuclear, which is part of a long-term shift to, I think, change the culture at the NRC to make it more pro-nuclear in a way that it actually allows different technologies to compete. But I think there's a lot of opportunities to really get into the weeds as what are the artificial government-imposed costs that are driving the reason it takes so long and it costs so much to build reactors in the United States. I'm very pro-nuclear, but I'm not pro-subsidized nuclear, which I think is very different given, you know, the history of nuclear power. But I do think there are so many policies in which the government inflates the cost of building, operating nuclear power plants. If you look at the security grade materials that they have to use, you know, whether it's for steel and cement, you know, these are the same materials that we use for buildings, and they are exactly the same, but because they have to go through all of these additional regulatory checkpoints and paperwork, you know, they end up being, you know, 2 to 4 times more expensive. We have regulations on radiation standards and low-dose radiation, as low as reasonably achievable standards, which make it more difficult to license some of these reactors. And then on spent fuel, this is something that has been a bit of a third rail, but I think it is something we need to address and fix if we want to have a long-term and sustainable nuclear power sector in the United States, because right now, The Nuclear Waste Policy Act of 1998 said that the federal government was supposed to take title of this waste, and they haven't collected an atom of spent fuel. And so what happened? All of these utilities sued the federal government for failing to fulfill their statutory obligation, and now we as taxpayers are paying out of the judgment fund for the government's failure to do this. And so this is something where, again, I think markets can really help drive where the waste producers are responsible for the waste management, and it's so disconnected from price signals and from property ownership that I think if you see opportunities where both Democrats and Republicans want to address this issue, and I think for too long we've focused on, how do we, build Yucca Mountain, and that just was dead on arrival for the longest time. But I think if we actually change the fundamental system, we could actually have a more market-driven policy for spent fuel management.
So prices, property, I would add to that, and this is a theme I think that you're getting from everyone, is lowering barriers to innovation. So asking the question, to what extent does that policy or that piece of regulation constitute an unnecessary barrier to innovation? And I mean, that's the question that I wake up every morning trying to grapple with. But I think if we kind of think of it in that framing of reducing barriers to innovation, and this is where Devin's political economy comes back in, because other than nuclear, the technology set in electricity has been pretty stable for the past century, for the most part. And so the incumbent utilities are very well versed in and very adept at investing in and deploying particular technologies, but then they are very invested in their business model, how they earn their revenue, and new technologies they can often perceive as a threat to that. And so using the existing regulations as that barrier to innovation is something they have an incentive to do. And I don't want them to do that. I want them to be the best darn wires companies they can be, but I would like to, that's kind of the footprint where I think the footprint of the regulated utility should stop, is at the head end where the generator comes on and at the meter. And I would even put the meter, I would say that we should treat meters the way we do cell phones. I'm a retailer, you sign up with me for a 3-year contract, you get your spiffy digital meter for free. But the Energy Policy, which one was it? Energy Policy Act of 2005, I think, took that off the table. But Devin asked about, in terms of collaborations, Devin asked about an initiative that he was a part of. Over the past year and a half, 2 years, I was leading a working group at the American Enterprise Institute called the Electricity Technology Regulation and Market Design Working Group. And Devin and Mike Giberson, both from our street, were members of that, and we had 20 some kind of blue ribbon panel level experts that from industry, policy, and academia, and most people had some kind of background in at least 2 of those 3 areas. And we came together and we were brought together across, this was completely apolitical. We were from all places throughout the entire multidimensional political spectrum, but came together around the idea that the role for markets and innovation in enabling a clean and prosperous future, so enabling the alignment of economic and environmental in the future, that the role for markets and innovation had not been sufficiently articulated or argued for. And so we wanted to do that in this working group. And so we wrote a report that was published in February, and we set out a framework taking as our starting point the idea, the reality that the electric grid is digitalizing, and that convergence of communication systems and power systems is turning our electric grid into a digital grid. And that digitalization has a lot of implications. It creates the ability for us to have more decentralized architecture and to be able, not necessarily to have the centralized top-down control that was the control paradigm for the 20th century, but that we can now use digital sensing, monitoring, and automation technologies both throughout the grid and around the grid edge to decentralize and have decentralized coordination as the operating standard rather than top-down control. And so that decentralization is one of the implications, obviously also enabled by innovation in distributed solar, electric vehicles, battery storage, and so on. And then other pieces of the framework involve democratization. And of course, not everyone wants to really care that much about their electricity use, but some people really, really do. And so these technological changes enable the people who really care to engage on that and really express their preferences. Whereas other people who are just like, I flip the switch and the light goes on and I pay a bill, that can happen too. So we have decentralization, democratization. In the report, we went out of our way to cast the framing as being much more customer-centric as opposed to utility-centric. And so we have some ideas that we always use in electricity about reliability. We recast that as dependability. That dependability is reliability, resilience, right? Because it's from the customer's perspective, I just want to be able to depend on my power. And what do we have to do throughout the system and at the policy layer as well to enable that dependability to occur? And that there are a lot of market transactions that occur to enable that dependability. One of the other pillars of our framework is, of course, decarbonization, not necessarily subsidy-driven decarbonization, but what can we do? And Devin kind of alluded to, for example, the Clean Energy Buyers Association, which has members like Meta and Google and Microsoft and Amazon who have commitments of, we are going to be operating a lot of data centers and we want to power them as low carbon as possible. And here's our glide path for making that happen. And so they're making investment decisions on those decarbonization principles, and that there are market mechanisms that you can use to enable, to lower the barriers to that happening where it makes technological sense. And then we have our final pillar, which is the idea of energy justice, which is a little challenging to have a conversation about in the current political environment because it gets kind of binned that word justice, going back to Aristotle, is a foundational principle, but it gets binned with social justice these days. But I'm going to stand up for it and say, no, yes, distributive justice, Rawls, yes, we have, that's a piece of this, but also procedural justice and just the idea of universal justice, that all individuals are equal in dignity and respect and in front of the rule of law, and that there are a lot of instances in the electric system where those principles are not honored at all, and we want to harness technology to enable that value to be honored into the future. So.
All right. Thank you very much, Chair. So after this, we get to talk about what we think RMI thinks about things. Is that okay with you, sir? No, we have about 5-6 minutes left here. So, there's also this element of I think there's a bow on some of the things we talked about on the optimistic light, but also part of optimism is not just flagging where the Overton window is, which we think there's increasingly amounts of liberty-compatible solution sets with environmental outcomes, but it's also about having respectful conversations about areas that we do not align on, and how we narrow the range of reasonableness that we consider in society for policies that are necessarily going to involve economic trade-offs in order to achieve environmental gains. And so I'd be curious what you all see in terms of how do we facilitate that conversation and alleviate some of the tensions between especially the liberty community and the environmental community, to not just work together more on where they increasingly align and should, but also agree to disagree productively and challenge each other in some areas in some productive ways, and what sort of the parameters of that might look like?
Yeah, I can start. I mean, I think more from a philosophical standpoint, it's breaking down kind of these technology and resource biases, that each, the left and the right seem to have about different energy sources and technologies. I think it's frustrating for someone who works for a conservative climate group that we are very much energy agnostic, but I think for far too long there's been skepticism from the right and the left, from the right about wind and solar specifically, and there's legitimacy about skepticism about the subsidies, about renewable portfolio standards at the state level, about the high costs of wind production tax credits and solar investment tax credits. But at the same time, I think there's more folks on the right who are increasingly weaponizing the laws that the environmental activists use to stop projects they don't like. And so I find that particularly frustrating, that NEPA was kind of always this cudgel that environmental activists like the Sierra Club and the Center for Biological Diversity would use to block oil and gas pipelines and forest management projects. And I had my frustrations with that, of course. But now you're seeing kind of similar opportunities for the right to do the same thing about projects that they don't like. And so it's one thing to argue something on the merit of is it good economic policy or not. It's frustrating to see where both the left and right are now using these laws to create obstructionism for all types of energy sources and technologies. And I think that's really going to come to a head if we start to see this increasing energy demand and costs escalate to make consumers and households and businesses really uncomfortable for the amount of money they're going to be paying on their electric bills. So I think wrestling with that there needs to be a recognition from the, I think, left and progressive movement that there's going to be fossil fuels and we're going to be using them, and the United States has a carbon advantage when it comes to producing oil and gas and exporting liquefied natural gas, and being understandable that blocking those projects makes us worse off economically and environmentally. And for the right, who has been so pro-innovation, to recognize the cost declines in things like solar technology and to allow these technologies to compete in the marketplace, and then really having a fundamental discussion of what subsidy reform looks like. I think that's really at the heart of the discussion that we're going to see over the next few weeks. I think that there's kind of different buckets in which you could layer a lot of these tax credits, ones that have been in place for a long time for mature technologies that I think do need to go away. And if we are going to have subsidies for more nascent technologies, maybe that's a better place to find some common ground. But again, even that creates some concerns, because some of these infant industry arguments for subsidies in the past, we know what happens is the industry doesn't grow up or doesn't lose its dependence on the subsidies. We saw that with electric vehicle tax credits. And so that is a dangerous game to play. I understand that. But I think trying to actually get rid of these technology and resource biases and actually have a productive discussion about the merits of the policy is very difficult and challenging to do, but I think it's what's necessary to actually have the good energy and economic policy we hope to achieve.
100%.
Well, we are about at time here.
Sorry, Lynne.
But no, this is great, and thank you both so much for your participation, and Sarah, wherever you are. But to put a bow on a lot of this stuff, it's just, you've heard anecdotally, but also in I know some abstract terms, the power of markets to advance our economic interests, which we've known for centuries, right? Ever since, especially since Adam Smith theorized on the invisible hand, and we saw how that materialized. We've also never seen the marketplace. We've never seen capitalism have a greener thumb than it does right now. But to overcome some of the sort of unforced errors, we do need to have some conversations within the environmental interest community and the economic self-interest and freedom community about where you have trade-offs. And I think that fiscal and environmental responsibility lens that you sort of teed up is going to be big, especially where Congress is weighing inevitable phase-outs for subsidies. If not this cycle, some year they will start to come down. And then we are going to have to start to go after those nuanced barriers to entry that inhibit capital stock turnover, which is really the thing that keeps energy costs artificially high and prevents deep decarbonization that, frankly, is far greater in emissions reduction potential than any of the subsidy or clean energy mandates combined right now, according to the recent literature. So with that in mind, please join me in thanking our panelists.